Hello, and welcome to the UpTown Waterloo Historical Walking Tour. My name is Doug Mulholland, and it's my pleasure to be your guide for this tour. This building was originally known as the Market Hotel, and was built in the 1850s in the Georgian Mennonite style. The actual market was located in the town hall basement, and later in the Market Hall, which was built in 1910, right about where you're standing right now. The stables and driving shed were located at the back part of the building. After numerous owners, the John Forsyth Company took over and made shirts, pajamas, and underwear here. This designated building was most recently the home of the New Canadian program, which helped many newcomers to Canada find employment. As you look at the buildings on the tour, you might ask yourself, if these walls could talk, what tales might they tell? 40 Albert Street is the Carnegie Library building. Today it's the National Office of Habitat for Humanity, but this building was originally the first public library in Waterloo. It was built between 1903 and 1905 in the classical revival style, with a grant obtained from American philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie had a lifelong interest in the establishment of free libraries for self-education. The library was actually built directly on top of Princess Street and was designated as a historical property in 1985. Note the trim under the eaves, brackets, dentils, and stained glass windows. Dentils are tooth-shaped ornaments along a cornice or top molding. The area in front of the library was the site of the first village hall and firehouse. Before it was taken over by Habitat for Humanity, this building was a detachment of the Waterloo Regional Police, and I have no doubt that those walls would have some interesting stories to tell. This is numbers 49, 51, and 53 Albert. This house was built in 1855 for George Randall and William Hespeler. The house was built in the Gothic Revival style. Rumor has it that at one time there were tunnels that went from the basement of the house over to the Hoover Hotel along Princess Street, possibly to avoid prohibition laws that had lasted from 1916 to 1927. The house is made from local yellow brick. The Snyder Seagram house at 50 Albert Street was built between 1903 and 1906 for Herbert Snyder, owner of Snyder Brothers Furniture. J.E. Froude Seagram, grandson of Joseph Seagram, was given the house as a wedding present in 1929. This impressive Edwardian house is architecturally interesting primarily for its poured concrete design and the Palladian windows, a collection of bay windows and the curved veranda. The house was designated in 1983 and is very similar to the house at 39 George Street, which was built at the same time for Herbert's brother Alfred Snyder. 54 Albert Street is a Victorian-style house that was built in 1891 for Dr. Charles Necker. Note the decorative gables and cornice brackets on the bay windows. Dr. Necker was medical officer of health for the town of Waterloo and consulting physician for Dominion Life Assurance Company. The house originally had a large lot with a small barn along Dorset Street. In 1902, Necker added an office, verandas, and a bay window to the house for $1,000. In fact, the local newspaper used to publish a report each year that detailed the amount that each resident had spent on renovations and additions. Evidently, Mr. Joseph E. Seagram was the subject of the report for several years. Dr. Necker's home was changed into apartments in the 1950s. The small white house on the northwest corner of Bridgeport and Albert at 65 Albert Street is frequently called the Ontario House because the Gothic style was very popular throughout Ontario at that time. It's characterized by the gable containing a pointed window. The house is stucco over brick and was built around 1860 by Elias Snyder. The Snyder family bought a large amount of land in the mill from Abraham Erb around 1828, and then more land from Abraham's adopted son, Barnabas DeWitt, around 1851. The house at one time had a front porch that went the length of the house. It's currently also divided into apartments. The next site is 71 Albert Street. This house was built about 1942 in the American Federal style for the Mueller sisters. Look at the concrete urns on the top of the front corner posts, the decorative downspout heads, and the front entrance. The fact that this house was built during the Second World War with such elaborate features is interesting, as a shortage in building materials made construction of new homes challenging. Most homes that were built during this time and in the immediate post-war era reflected a much more conservative approach. The narrow eaves are a trademark of wartime housing in Ontario. 79 Albert Street is a beautiful Victorian house with a tower, possibly built around 1907 by Franklin Good. His grandfather John Good bought a 148-acre parcel of land around present Albert and Bricker Streets, and cut a laneway from his farm to Herb Street and the grist mill. This laneway later became known as Albert Street. There was a smaller house on the site before this one was built, and many of the other houses along Yonge Street were built around this time as well. 36 Yonge Street West is the Volcker House. This former Gothic farmhouse originally stood on 300 acres of land and was built by Barnabas de Witt in 1849. The Volckers bought the home in 1940, and Dr. Philip Volcker had his practice in the house. Their house received one of Waterloo's first heritage designations in 1977. Note the turned porch posts, the Gothic window in the gable, the two bay windows, the panelled front door, and the bargeboard trim. The original shutters are best seen from Fountain Street, which runs north from Yonge Street beside this home. 66 Fountain Street is a simple styled frame house that John Snyder built around the year 1866. He was a foreman for the Waterloo Manufacturing Company Limited, which was located where Waterloo Town Square is now. His parents lived just around the corner on Albert Street, and his son's family lived next door at 70 Fountain Street, which is a 1.5-story Gothic-style house built in 1876. John Snyder's grandson, Albert Snyder, managed the Hotel Kent on King Street, which is now the Huther Hotel, for nearly 2 decades. 29 Spring Street West, the Charlie Volcker House, is a neo-colonial style house that Charlie Volcker designed and built for himself and his family. It reflects his love of the East Coast and Upper New York style of architecture. Charlie and Grace bought the lot for $210 in 1947 and watched as a horse and scoop dug a wet cellar. Mrs. Volcker believed that their lot was probably the smallest to ever get a building permit in Waterloo. There are front and back dormers on the upper story in the Dutch style. Other notable features are the very large window on the main floor and the little den off to the left side of the house. The house was designated as a historic property in 2004. On the northwest corner of Albert and Spring is 95 Albert Street. This small, pale green clapboard house was built about 1880 and originally had a barn and chicken coop with property stretching back to the park. The Enns family rented and then bought the house for about $4,000 around 1945. They sold off the back portion of the lot in the late 1940s. Back on the west side of Albert is 94 Albert Street. This 1.5-story house was built around 1856. The front 2 dormers were added on in 2004. 112 Albert Street is a house that George Pfaff had built in 1859 in the Mennonite Georgian style. Pfaff was a tailor, and part of the home was fitted as a residence and tailor shop, and part was made into a hotel. Note the front, symmetrical face with 5 openings upstairs and down, and the rubble stone lower course. Also be sure to see the round, ribbed iron plates on the 2 side walls at the attic floor level. These are anchor points for ties that help to secure the walls. Take a look at the Italianate house at 119 Albert on the corner of Albert and Central, heading towards the park. You can see the original fieldstone foundation, the bay windows with brackets, and the brackets under the eaves. This house was built in 1876. Voldemar Neufeld, a very well-known artist, lived here at 35 Central Street as a young man, after his family emigrated from Russia in 1924. The house was built in 1871 and can be seen in some of Neufeld's paintings and drawings. Notice the round anchor plates that were used to help secure the walls here as well. A visit to Homer Watson's studio in the nearby village of Doon proved to have a significant influence on Mr. Neufeld's career. Mr. Watson was a well-established Canadian painter at that time. Voldemar Neufeld's work is collected by many individuals and organizations, including the New York Metropolitan Museum, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Library of Congress. In 1988, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from Wilfrid Laurier University, where a large collection of his work is exhibited. Mr. Neufeld died in 2002, shortly after his 93rd 17 Central Street was built in 1866 as a residence, although the house is now a triplex. Notice the barge board in the peaks on the gable and end walls and the trim under the front porch roof. 7 Central Street is the Burkhardt House that was built by Samuel Burkholder in 1849. Becoming a residence in 1870, the house is a blend of the Mennonite, Georgian, and Gothic styles, and if you look closely at the brickwork, you can see how the house has changed over the years. The front gable was a later addition. Notice the barge board, finial, and on the end walls the return eaves, the small attic windows, and the unique S-shaped tie rod anchors on each end of the building. This house, at 115 King Street North, is estimated to have been built around 1850, and at one time it had a veranda and front yard. This property originally contained the first log schoolhouse in Waterloo. That school can now be found in Waterloo Park. 73 Dorset Street is an early 1920s arts and crafts style house, which recalls medieval history with its castle-like crenellation atop the side bay window. The arts and crafts style started in England as a reaction against industrialization and its negative effects on the population. Moving further along Dorset Street, the three houses at 69, 65, and 63 Dorset are all similar in style and typical of many in Waterloo, with the gable end facing the street. All were built in 1886 and are of yellow brick with segmentally arched windows. John Letter, a mason and builder of many homes and factories in Waterloo, built 63, 65, and possibly 69 as well, and lived in number 63 for 10 years. On the southwest corner of Dorset and Yonge Streets is 61 Dorset Street. Known as Bon Accord, it's a Victorian home that was built around 1897, and at one time it had a two-story veranda. The newer porch was added around the 1930s. A Scottish immigrant by the name of William Henderson lived here for several years. He was a baker and mayor of Waterloo from 1924 to 1925. On the southeast corner, on your left, is 62 Dorset Street. Known as Braeside, this home was built around 1896. Braeside is a Scottish term meaning hillside or slope. It's believed that the house was built for John Ritzer, who ran a tailor shop just down from the Waterloo Hotel and was a town councillor. Note the brackets framing the side bay windows on the second story and the turned spindles on the veranda. The belvedere was added onto the roof to allow more light in. Both Braeside and Bon Accord were built in a similar Victorian style. 85 King Street North, the white texture building, was built as a residence in the vernacular style in 1871. The term vernacular means owner-built and owner-specified. At the turn of the century, J.S. Roos, owner of the boot and shoe store over at Bridgeport Road and Regina Street, lived here. The stucco exterior has been altered recently, and the barn was demolished in 1958. At 59 King Street North, the Hoother Hotel's present facade was built in the 1880s with an imposing tower. Note the use of corbelled brickwork, keystones, and the second-story window arches. The building is designated as a historic property, as is the massive semicircular arched stone entrance and the vaulted ceiling of the original storage cavern. Behind the two glass display cases in the Lion's Den restaurant in the basement of the hotel are tunnels that go past the end of the building, possibly to the house over on Albert Street. What is now the bowling alley behind the hotel used to be the location of the stable area that was used for the hotel. On the far side of King Street is 56 King Street North. This was a 1930s style garage and auto service building. There was a ramp leading up the wide entranceway so that cars could pull right into the garage for maintenance. 35 King Street North, best known in Waterloo as the old post office, was built in 1912 at a cost of $50,000 and styled in the typical federal post office design of the day. This is a Romanesque style with a round arch treatment on the main facade. The post office occupied the first floor, the customs office occupied the front portion of the second floor, and the caretaker's apartment was on the third. The Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics currently owns this designated building, and the tower was recently restored. On the opposite side of King Street, 32 King Street North is currently the home of Carry On Comics, White Star Barbershop, and Kindred Spirit. Formerly called the Commercial Hotel, it was built about 1882 to replace an existing hotel that had burned down. The Commercial used to have a beautiful roofline and a corner tower that was removed in the early 1900s. Henry Razig purchased the building from Jacob Conrad in 1902, eventually calling it the Razig Hotel. He was also a town councillor and was said to be a popular landlord. The building is now the Kingsway Apartments, with stores on the main level, and is stucco over brick. The building at 31 and 33 King Street North was built in 1913. Don't miss the brick arcades in the second story and the dentil trim and bracketed eaves. It's believed that this corner originally had the first brick house in Waterloo, which was built in 1839, but was torn down when the new bank branch started building next door. At 27 King Street North, the Cibc Banking Centre used to be known as the Canadian Bank of Commerce, and this building is similar to many branch and banks built by that firm using a classical revival style portico. Note the decorative trim under the eaves. It was built in 1914, and in 1961 the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce was formed through the merger of the Canadian Bank of Commerce and the Imperial Bank of Canada. On the south side of the bank are four distinctive buildings at 23, 21, 19, and 15 King Street North. These buildings were built around 1869, and they all have a similar facade with arches over the windows and decorative roof lines. Even the taller one matches the appearance. The store at 23 was once the Bank of Commerce branch, and if you go inside you can see a beautiful stamped tin ceiling. Tin ceilings were cheaper, lighter, and easier to work with, although they were often made to resemble the more expensive decorative plaster ceilings, and they could be painted and styled to correspond with the style and decoration of the room. There are other buildings in uptown Waterloo that still have stamped tin ceilings as well. On the corner of King and Herb Streets is 1 King Street North, now the home of Hatashta Jewelers. There was a store located here as early as 1861, and this was the site of a post office until 1890. The site was used by the Bank of Toronto, which built the present Art Deco style building around 1924. Since the 1960s, the building has been used for several retail businesses. On the opposite side of King Street, at 4 King Street North, is the Waterloo Hotel. There's been a hotel here since about 1834, when Henry Bowman constructed the Farmer's Inn, later to be known as the Bowman House. A series of fires swept through the building, and in 1880, the hotel was rebuilt with a 2-story addition. The front section burned down again and was rebuilt in 1890, as noted by the date stone in the roof peak. A corbelled brick course along the roofline accents the peak of this designated building. The architecture is somewhat Victorian in style. The front and back sections blend well together with the same yellow brick in simple regular form. 3 King Street South, now the Bank of Montreal and formerly Molson's Bank, is a good example of classical bank architecture. Note the Ionic columns and the stonework over the windows. It was built in 1914, but the land that the bank was built on had been owned by William Snyder and used for a park by the public. When the town decided to tax Snyder on the land, he decided to sell it to the town, but when the town wouldn't buy it, he sold it to Molson's Bank, and thus Waterloo lost its original town square. 2 to 8 King Street South is a building block currently occupied by King Street Cycles, down to the Crystal Palace restaurant that was known as the Commercial Block on the 1861 map. The block was built in 1857. Number 4 King Street is the only designated storefront, and all 4 sections would have originally looked the same with the arched windows and ornamental brickwork. The building first served as a pharmacy, and the interior includes an early tin ceiling with connections for gas lights. Don't miss the original coal chute on the right-hand side of number 4, and the Dominion Life Assurance Company founding plaque. It was here in 1888 that the idea for that company was first discussed. All 4 buildings have had numerous owners, including Frank's Jewelers and Seagram's Liquor Store. In 1883, whiskey sold here for 75 cents per quart, which is about 1.1 litres. The next stop is at 16 King Street South, which is currently Ontario Seed Home Hardware. Looking up at the date stone, you can see that this building was originally the central block and was built in 1881. The arched roofline gives the building an air of distinction. The window trim is of that period as well. Elias Snyder sold the property to William Snyder and Aaron Craft, and they had the building constructed in the same year. The Ontario Seed Company began in Waterloo in 1906 and in 1911 Jacob Uffelman purchased the business, and it remains in the family to this day. 44, 46, and 48 King Street South is a humble building that is actually one of the oldest in Waterloo, having been built in 1849. The Keeler family lived in the building and ran an ice cream parlor out of the left-hand side until 1905. Be sure to notice the decorative brickwork under the eaves. The building originally had 3 dormer windows, which have now been removed. The Grand Trunk Railway built an extension to Waterloo around 1882, and this station was built in 1910 to replace an older building. During peak travel, the station serviced 9 trains a day, 6 passenger and 3 freight. The station was the focus of many historical events, including the departure place for troops serving in the World Wars. This Romanesque building is typical of Grand Trunk railway stations. All 4 facades, the entire roof line, and the interior vaulted ceiling carry a historical designation. On the west side of Regina Street, on the south side of the railway track, is 25 Regina Street, the Button Factory. Richard Rockman built the button factory in 1886 after learning the trade of the Berlin-Kitchener button works of Vogelsang and Schanz. By 1900, the factory had over 100 men and women employed, and the buttons were made out of imported shells and ivory nuts. The invention of the zipper and a shift to plastic buttons, among other things, ultimately resulted in the factory closure in the 1940s. The building, designated in 1982, is a fine example of late 19th century industrial architecture, with large windows to allow in as much natural light as possible. The oldest part of the Waterloo Regional Police Building was built around 1880 as an early head office for Mutual Life Assurance Company, now Sun Life Financial, before they moved to their present location at King and Union Streets in 1912. The lions were added in 1904, and the columns were added around the 1950s. Also notice the pediments with dentils. It's been my pleasure to be your guide today, and I hope you've enjoyed the tour. If you haven't already done so, you might want to try the other tour in this series, the Mary Allen Neighbourhood Historical Walking Tour. As well, more information about the history of Waterloo is available in the Ellis Little Local History Room in the main branch of Waterloo Public Library. There is also much more information about the city and its history online, starting at the library's website at www.wpl.ca. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this tour, and a special word of thanks also goes to the many people who helped to make it possible, including the property owners and the Ontario Ministry of Culture for helping to fund the production of the tour. Have a great day here in Waterloo.